Hi, I'm Cara MacDonald, and in a moment we'll begin our presentation. So I am Cara, and I'm presenting on behalf of Sanyang Park and myself. Sanyang Park is currently in flight from Daegu to San Francisco International Airport, so I'm presenting on our behalf for the work that we've done for this presentation, Diversity and Learner Negotiation of English Second Language Identity, Implications for Korean English Language Teaching Practice. The overview is here. We do bring into the L1 identity as well as it informs the second language identity. We're going to start with a little short video that's just considering a student's identity with something as simple as a name. And then we'll go into some background and rationale for interest in the topic, what work we've done related to identity and second language learning, and how we came to be interested in the work that we've done here for this presentation. We also have general principle literature around the topic if you're not familiar with language and identity for language learning, just to kind of frame it for you. Identity and its components, and then we'll move to identity in the classroom and also activities for the classroom for you to take and adapt in your context. So that we're not just seeing my face in a PowerPoint slide, to make it a little more interactive for you, or engaging, not interactive, engaging. We have a few videos and also a lot of images just to kind of draw you in to try to make this more effective as an asynchronous session. So starting off here, we're going to take a look at something as simple as a name and how that impacts learner identity. So this video is coming from something from National Public Radio in the US, and it looks at, or it's coming from StoryCorps, which is a program on this radio where once a week they have conversations with individuals, and then they're recorded, and it's just kind of documenting humans' experiences, and sometimes they get made into cute videos as well. So we're going to take a look at this, and I'm going to take us over to, I'm going to take us over to the PowerPoint away from.
My name, when I started kindergarten, was Ramon. And by the time I was in the second grade, everybody was calling me Raymond. You know, out in the playground, in the classroom, Raymond, hey, Raymond, hey, Raymond. I'm trying to adjust to this, you know what I mean? And if there was a girl named Maria, her name became Mary. And Juanita became Jane. So one day, we got a new student by the name of Facundo Gonzalez. Facundo Gonzalez, man. When he came into school, we noticed they called it an emergency administrative meeting. You could kind of hear him talking to the door. You know, what are we going to do with this guy, man? You know what I mean? How are we going to change his name, you know? And one teacher goes, well, you know what? Why don't we try to shorten the name a little bit? And they go, yeah, well, but how do you spell it? Facundo. They go, well, why don't we just spell it FAC? And one of the teachers, well, that would mean his name would be Fac. And the other teacher looked at it, no, and you know, that sounds too much like a dirty word. You can't be saying Fac. Where's your homework, you know? Where's Fac at? You know what I mean? Well, that was a trip we always remembered going to elementary school, because Facundo was the only guy who never got his name changed.
Talk about what was it that we actually saw there in terms of a name, and not saying that it's wrong to change students' names. It's often something that they want. They want to take on a new identity in that second language. Others don't. So it's just there to put out there as something as we're going forward, not making a judgment about it. But this was just something to kind of launch the discussion. So the implications of a name would take a look here, that we see that we can obviously change our students' names, and they might often choose to do that. They like to select an English name because it gives them a sense of identity. So hello, my name is in one class, but in another class, they might be taking something else because Mengwu prefers to be Peter when he's in the English class, or in certain roles throughout his day, depending on how he uses and sees English. So it's not really that there's a judgment again, it's just kind of taking a look at identity at that core level of something simple as a name. So the presenters here have an interest in the exploration of learner identity, because oftentimes, right, we have like the image here, we have a cow, but it speaks cat or kitten. So oftentimes what we see on the outside isn't really what is on the inside, linguistically, but also social linguistically, as who the person is and how do they identify themselves. And I think that it's interesting, and there's a lot of curiosity about, for us, about what is a learner identity, how do they negotiate that, because it's not something static, and we'll see that a little farther on. So we have a standing interest in identity. Most recently, this colleague and I, Sun-Young Park and I, at the 2019 Korea TESOL International Conference, we did a small study looking at multicultural households, so households that had 3 languages, looking at students who were in foreign international schools. And we kind of looked at how did they negotiate their identity, what was the role of language in each of their domains throughout their day, and then what did that mean for the classroom? And that was really interesting for us. Some other work we've done just to kind of give you a sense of what we're interested in. I'm not going to read all of them, you can just take a look, but we're obviously sort of interested in social capital, and how that social capital and language and identity impact Asian American students. That would be in the US context. We've looked at Arab American students and their English language identity and what social capital they bring. We've done other contexts that just look at identity in general, here in the US context. We've looked at multicultural families in the US context, as well as in the Korean context that I just previously explained on the prior slide. We've sort of looked at diverse linguistic communities, so to get kind of implications for critical language teaching and how that impacts intercultural communication, ICC that you see there, and learner identity. And we have explorations of linguistic landscapes. So we've looked at what are the linguistic landscapes in the Korean context, and there's a submission in review for the English connection, and we'll see if that is able to be published and available for members in the future. So just moving to a little literature around the topic. So it's just kind of founding work, seminal work. So there's a notion of identity, and Bonnie Norton, Pavlenko, and many others that you've seen there, they see identity as something socially constructed, discursive, and narrative. So it's something that's created in the society, discussed in the society, and there's a story that can be told, right? Your identity can be a narrative of yourself. Also, there's a notion of it being the multiplicity of it. So it's fragmented and hybrid. So it's not just that we have one identity, we can have these sub-identities and they become very hybrid or fragmented within the larger identity. We have the notion of intersectionality, and the idea of, we have different races, we have different ethnicities, we have different religions, and how do those intersect together in a social setting? We have hybridity in the third space, so that we have this first language, second language, but then there's this alter space for us. Identity and imagination. So we have our identity and then we have an imagined identity. So basically what we're seeing here is that it's very complex and dynamic. It's not something that is just, I guess, flat. It's very dynamic, it could be 3-dimensional if you wanted to see it that way. Just some more related topics. So we have the influence on culture, on identity, and the influence of language on identity, and the intercultural competence and the intercultural communicative competence, and what that level of competence is, and how does that impact how one sees or doesn't see himself within a particular community. So what we're started off here, what brought us to this presentation and this initial work, there's a recent book out that came out in 2020, and you can see the cover there. It's a compilation of a very thick book. I could say it's fat, meaning thick, but fat also with PH in terms of being very rich. There's different chapters from a variety of authors looking at the facts around or topics around critical practice. And what does that mean for English language teaching and inquiry and advocacy? So the book begins off by sharing that, there's been a lot of hegemony just around, the field of TESOL and English language teaching. And as time has been going on, we see how it's evolved as a field to be more open, looking at social justice and this critical practice that we have. So we enjoyed this book a lot. And we found really one chapter that was super interesting was about the role of exploring students' L1 and EFL identities in monolingual as well as multilingual classrooms. And the chapter describes that it assists teachers to better understand their students' personal L1 social linguistic identity. In this case, it would be Korean. It's an international conference, so maybe it's not Korean. I just put it there as an IE, maybe it should have been EG, but whatever the student's L1 is, and the relationship with and the negotiation of that within their English identity as they progress through their studies. And by sharing activities and projects to explore complex interrelationships between language, culture, and their students' social cultural identities. So we're going to build off of that chapter, which is summarized here in these 3 bullet points, and then take us to look at the role of that L1 and moving it to the examination of the L2, because the L1 therefore has some impact. The L1 identity has some impact on that of the L2 for English. So the chapter that I spoke of is written by McNeil, and we draw off of that work, as I said, but then we link it to this significant research on L2 identity, as I mentioned, focusing on ESL context, but also EFL context. You can see the major authors and the work that has been done to kind of frame this field of language and identity studies. The L2 EFL identity equally as significant across the globe, right? So McNeil argues that knowledge of students L1 should be part of language teacher awareness. So normally language teacher awareness has consisted obviously of our pedagogical practice, obviously our content knowledge, and then kind of our classroom practices. But he discusses that something as simple as language teacher awareness that we've already had for so long and an understanding of it in the field, we should invite the consideration that knowledge of the student's L1 should be part of that language teacher awareness because it is part of the student, right? We know our students, what they like and what they, their hobbies and things, but also adding that in terms of their L1 and knowledge awareness. And he, in the chapter, focuses on L1 descriptive profiles. So he has a questionnaire that he offers for mother tongue profile. So comparing, what's the writing system, what's the grammar system, these very basic things. And then, so let's say lexical and grammatical profile comes out of that questionnaire. The next questionnaire is mother tongue status in the learner's country. So that questionnaire gives you kind of the social status in terms of use. Is it an official language of the country? If it's an official language, how is it used? Where is it used? So kind of that, where some countries, the students L1 might not be the actual official language of the country, nor the language of instruction in school. So just kind of getting into that social linguistic kind of components of a student's L1. And then it also kind of looks at language policy on the L1. So how does the language policy in the country impact that status, which relates to the previous second bullet point? So with this, we found it really interesting when we were kind of thinking of different contexts that we are familiar with in terms of the presence of multicultural and multilingual contexts. So we built off of this importance of understanding the L1 to encompass the learning of English and how does that impact the English identity. So if learners share with us through profiles or through activities that you design in your classroom to better understand their L1, and then also therefore you're understanding how their L1 informs their identity. And that's going to intersect with how they negotiate coming to identify their own identity as an English learner or English speaker. So with that, that's framing where we came from in terms of our work, what we're interested in, and a brief overview of the literature. I'm going to take you to look at a video just to make it a little more engaging. And we're going to take a look at identity and its components. And apologies, I will need to go to my browser again. For whatever reason, the links are not working well for me today, so we're improvising. Here we go. So this video is for you.
Another way to think about identity is to think that there's actually different categories of identities that we can select from. So there are psychological identities. So these are identities that we have mentally and emotionally, or so how we perceive ourselves mentally and emotionally. Then there are individual identities. So for ourselves, who do we think we are at our core? There are social identities. So these are how we portray ourselves when we're out amongst other people, whether they be friends or strangers. Then there's our collective identity. And so these are the specific groups that we say, okay, I belong to this group or I belong to that group. And finally, there is a cultural identity or cultural identities. And these are the cultural groups that we feel we belong to and somehow portray to the world that, hey, I'm a part of this cultural group. Researchers into the concept of identity used to think that human beings and each individual had one single identity. And they also used to think that that was a fairly static entity. So, you know, we formed our identities as we were growing up, and then we kept those identities once we reached maturity. Current research, however, says that both of these ideas are actually incorrect. So we don't have a single identity. We actually have multiple identities. And we pull out whichever identity we want to use depending on the context we're in. So we can have identities based on gender, social class, education level, personal interests, our occupation, and so on. And depending on the context we're in, we'll pull out those identities. And we can also have different cultural identities as part of our multiple identities. And once again, we can pull out whichever cultural identity fits a specific situation. Part of having multiple identities is also having our identities change over time. So as time goes on and we have different experiences, so for example, as we live in different cultural groups, or we have different occupations, or we go through other life changes, such as getting married and having kids, we add identities to our overall collective group of multiple identities. Central to the idea of multiple identities is the idea that we tap into different identities depending on the situations that we're in. So identity really is very situation dependent. I can't stress that enough. And the other interesting thing with this collection of multiple identities is that we can actually have within us different identities that seem to be quite contradictory. So we could have one identity that has this particular value, but another identity has a different value that's almost opposite to that first one. But we pull these opposing identities out in different situations. So for example, someone could have an identity in which they're quite quiet and reserved, but in another situation, that same person could be fairly loud or talkative or fairly aggressive. So these are two quite contradictory identities, but they reside within the same person, and that person chooses to activate those identities in different situations. In order to fully understand multiple identities, there's one other piece we need to add in, and this is a concept called narrative of self. If each person is juggling multiple identities, it's really hard for that person to hold himself or herself together as a unified entity. So if you've got all these different identities going on in you, how do you really hold yourself together and say, at my very core, this is who I am? And so researchers came up with this concept of narrative of self, sorry. The narrative of self is kind of a story that we tell ourselves internally that helps us connect all of these multiple identities and hold them together in that unified whole. And the narrative of self really is the story of our lives. It's the story of all of the experiences we've gone through that have enabled us to form these different identities that we can tap into. There's another way that we can look at identity that adds another layer to this concept of multiple identities. And this is the idea that we have a primary identity and then multiple situational identities. So our primary identity is who we are at the core. This is our primary self. So this is our set of values and beliefs and experiences that we really feel define us as an individual. And this is an identity that actually doesn't change very much over time. Okay, so this is our most stable identity, and it's the one we always go back to. So that's the primary identity. Then around this primary identity, we have situational identities. And these are identities that we pull out depending upon the context we're in. And we make our choices depending on a lot of things. So we've got covert and overt prestige factoring in there. So do we want to belong to a standard group, or do we want to belong to an outsider group? So there's in-group and out-group going on there as well. Do we want the people we're with to save face in a particular way? So I'm going to pull out this specific identity to allow that to happen. So there's a lot of relational choices that go into our selection of situational identities. We really make our situational identity choices based on the people we're with and the context we're in and the nature of those relationships.
Okay. So we've had an opportunity to take a look and hear from her regarding what is identity. And you can see a lot of the things she talked about kind of were presented in the general kind of overview of the literature that we have seen earlier. So just to sort of kind of link that presentation by her to kind of ourselves in terms of a learner's L1 identity and a learner's L2 identity. So we have this identity in the center, and she told you there's multiple identities, but also within those multiple identities, sometimes the values change and sometimes they don't, whether it's a core identity or not. So we could think about looking at our students and ways that we could look at how do we explore students' identities, right? Some students might be quite young and they maybe aren't there yet thinking in the abstract form of who they are. Other students, yeah, they could be late high school or university, and that's kind of an easier thing to kind of bring up that discussion. So just to kind of think about some tangible things, and as I talk, you can think about how you might be able to kind of explore these in your classroom with respect to their L1 identity and their L2. At the end of presentation, we do have tangible activities that you can build off of, but just conceptually here. So I'll start over on the right, midway through with beliefs. So we could explore students' different beliefs about anything. It could be politics, could be about family, could be about, I don't know, lifestyles, anything. What are their beliefs? What do they hold dear to themselves? Religion, social kind of practices, all these things are something that really build us. And then going down, appearance. And appearance, if you're parents, you kind of know this, like as a student or your child grows, it's kind of nice and very interesting to see how they change. What costumes do they put on at certain times for play? How does their desire for what they want to wear to school or outside? I mean, at school, there's a uniform in many countries, but you know, what are their appearance choices? What are their hair choices? And I know in some cultures as well, the hair choice for girls and boys is kind of somewhat deemed right by a policy. But how do they express themselves as much as they can over time in the classroom within, you know, whatever constraints they have? And then moving to ethnicity. How do they relate to their ethnicity? Is it really a critical part of them? Is it something that's ancillary to them? It will be very different for different people. And then moving to practices and habits. What practices do they have? What habits do they have? The practices could be religious, the practices could be family practices, the practices could be social. What habits do they have? And how do those fit in and inform who they are? So, you might have one practice in the L1, and that's really important for your L1 identity, but that practice isn't part of your L2 identity. And does that somehow come in and the student still holds it as part of their L2, or it kind of slips away? Again, work and hobbies. So I see here, if students aren't working, that would be school. And hobbies, what are they interested in? Are they really into skateboarding? Are they really into taekwondo? Are those things really important to them and they're part of their core, or is it just something they do in their spare time? Family and friends. So how does that inform who a student sees themselves? So in their L1, a family is probably a very large part of who their learner identity is. But how does that family intersect or come into play or not into play when they're negotiating their L2 identity? And that's moving up to interests. So the same thing might come in with hobbies, but it might not necessarily be something that you do. It just might be something you're interested in, like particular movies or particular foods. Objects and possessions. So what things do they have that really inform who they are, that are dear to them? Maybe they might have an object from a grandmother and very dear in their L1 identity and informing them, but does that come into play in the L2? And then their creations, what do they create in and outside the classrooms? And choices, what choices do they make and how do those choices inform them? And finally, we end up with values, which is very close to where we started with beliefs. And do those values change within an L1 identity or an L2 identity? Sun Young Park and I find this really interesting. Sometimes we can set up activities where we're actually doing a comparison, right? We might be comparing the L1 grammar with the L2 grammar to be able to better understand why there's a struggle. But comparing the L1 identity with the L2 identity in a particular facet that you see here, maybe it's values. It's interesting how the values kind of shift. They don't go away, but they do shift and kind of adapt or adjust a bit between different identities in the first and second language. So now I want to take us to Jim Cummings. I'll give you another video. So if you don't know who Jim Cummings is, he's done a lot of work and then also on language and identity. And here in this video, he speaks of and kind of addresses the ESL context and a multilingual context within North America. He considers how elements of a learner's language and identity relate to how does that relate to Asian EFL context and its learners. So when you watch this video, he's speaking of a North American ESL context that's multilingual and about those students coming into the classroom and how they see themselves as English learners, English speakers, and then how they see the identity of their L1. Just go with it and kind of, I know it's not the Korean context, but just go with it and kind of reflect on what he's saying and make connections to how you think it might relate to your context, whether it be Korea or elsewhere in Asia and Southeast Asia. And when he's done, I'll come back and I'll kind of make a connection as how Sun Young Park and I see it as informative for a non-North American context. So again, I'll pop out of this and we'll go back over to my browser.
When a student comes to school speaking a language other than the dominant school language, that's part of his or her identity. That's part of who they have been up to this point in time. Some students come to school speaking multiple languages. Many students may have been in refugee camps in different countries. They may have been in schools in different countries. They've learned multiple languages. And when that kind of linguistic capital is not acknowledged within the school, it's shutting off a lot of their accomplishments as not being relevant. And that communicates a message to the student that what they are is a second language learner of Swedish or English, an incompetent speaker of those languages in the early stages. Somebody who can't understand the textbooks and at the grade level. And so that's a process of negotiating identities, that if the teacher is not aware of the importance of language for the way students feel about themselves, it can have a very negative effect on the extent to which students will be willing to engage academically. And so rather than seeing students as multilingual students who have a variety of linguistic accomplishments, who have maybe had a wide range of experiences, who have got to Sweden or got to Canada based on their extraordinary intelligence, their initiative, their ability to survive and their resilience. We see students sometimes only as somebody who needs help, somebody who is deficient in the language of instruction. And when we put students into that identity cocoon, we risk diminishing them in terms of who they are and who they can be. And so, and we know also that those teacher expectations can get internalized by the students. And many of them will say, well, you know, I'm not that bright. I'm not ever going to make it to high school. I'm not going to make it to college or university. Why bother making the effort? I'll go out and try and become a mechanic or do something relatively low level in terms of professional qualifications within the society. And so when teachers understand more about the crucial role that language and language learning plays in students' sense of self and in their academic aspirations, then I think they can look at ways of communicating to students that their multilingualism or their knowledge of their home language is an important intellectual accomplishment. It's something that they should cherish, that they should continue to develop. It's important also to communicate this message to parents, because parents don't know this. And so when we look at the role of language, the role that language plays in identity, there's all kinds of implications for how we interact with students and how we organize the curriculum. And this is not just at the level of the individual teacher, it's at the level of the school. Does the school have a policy in relation to students' multilingualism? Is the implicit policy communicated to students that they should leave their languages, their cultures that the school has stored, that they're not really relevant in the school environment? That's incredibly diminishing of communities and individual students. And schools that take a much more positive orientation to students' multilingualism, bring it into classroom, encourage students to carry out work in their home languages as well as in English or Swedish or whatever the school language might be. For example, through writing dual language books, tend to succeed much better because students are feeling acknowledged for their accomplishments. They adopt a much more positive attitude towards their home language. They're more curious about their parents' cultural background and their experiences. And students, these schools are vibrant places. And teachers are happier in these schools.
Okay, we'll swing back to our PowerPoint slide. So just resting here with this slide for a moment, just to take a look at what he said and kind of drawing it to maybe multilingual contexts in Southeast Asia, or either, you know, monolingual contexts such as Korea, and then the large presence of English and English language learning. So he's looking at a very different context, and it may overlap with presenters in different ways depending on where you're currently teaching. But if we're looking at the Korean context, but also just in general, I think he brings up a lot of good points that relate to the Korean context in terms of identity. So oftentimes, you know, we come in, and of course, with the best intentions, we close the door on Korea, we close the door on Korean, and we kind of use the English language as kind of, you know, English through English, right? And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, the more that you're exposed to it, the more that you're seeing it as a tool for communication rather than just a subject to learn, it builds proficiency, and there's nothing wrong with that. And Korean does enter the classroom when we have, you know, native Korean speakers teaching English. And then there is kind of a notion that the Korean identity and the Korean culture and the Korean language enter the classroom. But I just put it out there in terms of a consideration of, you know, in what ways can we kind of bring in things from the Korean culture into the English language classroom. So he spoke about dual language books, but I mean, what if students were writing about Korean cultural things, but using English? So something, I don't know, explaining solal or story or something that's an important aspect of culture for them, how they view something in the Korean culture that really informs their identity. And they can write or draw, depending on the level, like draw and then have, you know, phrases or word level, depending on the level and the age of the student. Or it could be a narrative, just to kind of think about acknowledging that person that comes in the classroom. Another thing that he mentioned that I think is important and relevant anywhere as well is that we want to not always view our students as kind of, you know, deficient in something with respect to the English language, because they are learners, but at some level they are speakers at the level that they're capable and they're able to make their needs known in English. So it's not necessarily maybe, you know, a correct construction or a typical construction, but just this notion that a learner is developing their language, but they're also already have an identity in that language, even if they're still very early in their proficiency development, and kind of exploring that as well. Just acknowledging and legitimatizing, right, the learner, where he used the word, you know, or cocooning them in a deficient way. And I don't think we do that as teachers explicitly. It's sort of it's not that we're cocooning them in deficiency. I think a better word is that we just are promoting their learning, and maybe we don't look at opportunities for them to show us who they are in their English identity, right? I would use a little kind of more opening language, but moving to the next slide. So we are going to take some opportunities to kind of look at tangible things that we can do in the classroom. I mentioned a couple on the last slide. And when I'm sharing these, I want you to kind of consider how you may use or adapt the following activities in your classroom, right? For the age of your learner, for the size of your class, for the content that you're teaching, the proficiency of the student, right? And then also, what areas of language do you want to know? What do you want to know about the Korean language that maybe you don't know? Maybe you already know quite a bit. You've been teaching, or, you know, whatever this child's first language is. And maybe it's just that you want to know about their identity, right? What do you want to know about their L1 identity? What do you want to know about their English identity? And then these activities can be, depending again on the learner and the age and the proficiency, they can be long projects, they can be short activities, or they could just be a brief incidental sort of thing that you do kind of consistently throughout a week or through a semester, or depending on, you know, how your course is set up. So it can be as explicit or kind of implicit in terms of how the learner is seeing what information you're gathering from them. So this identity game, so you can see there that they have numbers that have been placed on the floor in a circle. And then they have cards or sheets of paper that have a statement. I am, I can, I believe that, I learning to, places where I spend my day, and then number 6, I enjoy. So this is on the floor. It might be better suited maybe for something, you know, if they're younger learners or something where you want to get students up and moving. The same thing could be done by creating a handout and you just have students working in groups. It also could be something so simple as making a large poster and having students create kind of like a showcase, and they look and come to know each other. So it could be adapted in many ways. But consider how these concepts maybe could be adapted for different age groups and different language levels. And particularly if we start with these simple statements, I am, I can, I believe that, right? These are things that are really getting at a personal identity, maybe something that is closer to a core identity, but we're still getting students to relate to something that's in their inner world, right? That's tangible in their world, something that they explicitly know about themselves. So this is also good for maybe younger students, maybe adolescents that maybe like middle school that quite haven't been able to think about these concepts and maybe not able to express large abstract ideas about themselves, in English yet. So it's kind of narrowing it and kind of giving a kind of a scaffolding for less proficient or younger students to begin to kind of share with you and also share with their classmates how they see, their L1 identity or their L2, right? And then you can compare them. And then this is very tangible, but also next, think about how different aspects of identity could be addressed through an adaptation of this game on the floor or a poster or a handout. So what if you had a more adult learner, somebody at university that maybe has a better level of proficiency? How could you adapt these simple statements that are prompts for learners to share about themselves? How can you get at something a little more abstract, like we saw in that, image of identity in the middle? What statements could we get to get at beliefs, values? So we could get things in terms of changing it around, in terms of maybe one is, I don't know, let's see, language policy in society means, and that could be number one. Maybe number two, English language policy, how it impacts me, number two, and kind of unpacking. So kind of going around with these 6 locations, but changing the prompts so that you're getting slowly at the societal level of a topic, a belief or a value, and moving them slowly down to what they believe. So how does society see it? Second, how does that impact me? And then how does that impact my identity? So if there's, for some, religion may be something that's, pervasive in a society and important to learners. So you can kind of unpack that. You also could unpack maybe current events, and then moving, how does that policy of a current event, how does that get back to you and impact your identity? So there's lots of ways you can deal with the abstract, just by adjusting kind of what you place on the card, right? That allows the learner to tap into more abstract language and maybe more complex language structures. And lastly, I've already said a couple things of how this game could be played, right? It doesn't always have to be everybody standing up and going around in the circle, right? As they go around the circle, they share and answer. But it could be a handout. They could be on index cards, and you're, passing them out in a group. And it's kind of like an info gap, jigsaw puzzle kind of activity among each learner having a card with the question on it or the prompt on it. It can be a poster session. It could be done in terms of like groups, not individually, but like a group identity in terms of how do they see themselves as an English class, because of the notion of a collectiveness in terms of they see themselves as a group, as a part of a class, maybe not only themselves. And then how does that impact their second language identity? On and on and on. Moving to another example, going back to that idea of a name, we saw with Facundo, and then, on my slide after the video, you saw that, we have a list of Korean names and then some English names that maybe those students might have taken for themselves. So you could do this activity for both, the native L1 name, as well as any possible given English name that the student may use. And you could compare and contrast them if you wanted, or you could just do one or the other. So you can't really see well on what's hanging here, but identity project. So what's in a name and things that might come out of a name the name might represent something, it has a meaning, right? Then it might represent something with respect to the culture or ethnicity. It might relate to something in the family, in the meaning that maybe my grandma was named this and now I'm named this. It also might come with some values based on the name of the meaning or a value that the student has applied to the name that they have. Also, that name might come to some sort of connection of beliefs that the student has. It might connect to their interests. So in all these sort of things, there's so many things that a name means to someone. So if you have a younger set of learners, you probably aren't going to have so many, let's say, bubbles. Now, this doesn't even need to be done as kind of a project artwork type thing that's hung on the wall for a showcase among the class. It could also be done just with a little graphic organizer, and students do it on paper and share, right? But the younger the learner or the lower the proficiency, they're probably not going to have so many bubbles because the younger learner hasn't yet gotten to the real abstract notion of their name. They're still going to be connecting it to more concrete things within society and their family. And they also might not have the language. But as you move forward, students that have more language and have more identity, more ability to look at identity in an abstract way, you'll find that they can do quite a lot, right? They come up with a lot because one thing opens up to another. So there's one sort of little activity, and I think it's really interesting to do it for the L1 name, and if there is an L2 name, what's the difference between them? It's kind of a fun exploration for students. And if the student doesn't have an English name and their English classroom name is their L1, what does that mean for them in their L2 identity, right? It's all meaningful and very, very interesting to kind of unpack and explore those things. And things like this could take a long time. You might do it over time, right? It might be that if it's a graphic organizer, maybe they just fill out one bubble, a short activity at the beginning of one class, and next week you fill out another bubble. You're kind of staging it, and you can adapt based on the curriculum and the scheduling of your classes, of course. And here we have another ideas of just exploring. So I gave you two concrete examples of projects and how those projects could be adapted, right? So that they could be done with less materials, less time. But here I'm just giving you a whole bunch of just different examples of things that we've done and can be done. So it's just about cultural conversations, identity conversations. So a drawing jam, so drawing about their L1 or their L2 identity. And of course, we want to get them to use English. They can talk to that drawing, right? That's a speaking activity. Identity narratives, right? They can write a little story about their identity in one or the other. Again, we saw what is a name, that can be there. Exploring cultural stereotypes. So, it could be an L1 stereotype or an L2 stereotype that they're aware of, and how do they feel that they are like that or they are not like that? And that informs kind of how they see themselves, right? And the identity that they see in themselves. Investigating cultural symbols. I really enjoy kind of having students kind of take a cultural symbol, either from the L1 environment or the L2 environment, and kind of get at what is that symbol? What is obviously we have a concrete level of what it is. What is the, kind of the meaning, the societal meaning under that physical object? And then really underneath, what are the beliefs and values that create that? So you might just have something like, I don't know. Okay, a handbook, right? So you have the physical description, and then you have the social use. It could be now, could be earlier in history, but underneath, what are the values and beliefs about that garment and its existence even in today's cultural society, and how the student relates to that? And you can do the same thing with an English object. I remember somebody doing this, and they chose as a an L2 English object as kind of a big jacked up pickup truck. And it's very different from their culture, and they kind of went through, right, describing the big jacked up pickup truck, and then went and said, well, what does that mean for society? Like, where in the US American society would you find such a truck? And then, you're not going to find it in New York, well, you might, but I mean, in general, where is the social, geographic, and social cultural context? And then in that social, cultural, geographic context, what's the meaning? What are the values and beliefs under having a very rugged vehicle, and so on and so on? So it's very, very interesting. I love it. So then also you can have students that are older that are able to have the language as well as the being able to dig into the bottom of the iceberg, as sometimes that's said, of understanding kind of the values and belief systems that they have, exploring those values and belief systems and explaining them through different projects, essays. As you can see, examples, right? We have these examples on the side where someone has done a drawing of herself, and then there's another drawing above. So it has some language plus, kind of another drawing, but the drawing relates to what she's been able to draw about who am I. L1, L2 portfolio projects. So it can be something that's done over time where they're building a little portfolio. Something could come out in a presentation. So this could come not only as a showcase, but something where they're giving a presentation about a particular aspect of their identity. Identity essays, and then just an identity interview where kind of as if you're on a talk show, right? So one student is having these questions, kind of asking about the student, as if they're a famous author or figure in society, and then we're learning about that student, and then students can switch roles, right? And they can do it just as an activity in the classroom to share, or they could do it in a context where they're presenting to everyone in the class, depending on who volunteers. And moving forward, as we're coming to the end of the hour, I just want to let you know, because this is an asynchronous session, if you have any questions, feel free to email myself or Sun Young Park. Our emails are there. And with that, I'm going to take us to our references. And the principal references are here. And you can see that we have mentioned them earlier in the presentation in terms of the literature and what brought us to actually looking at this exploration of L1 and L2 identity together. And finally, we have a lot of references that relate to what the content that we presented here. The videos, obviously, you can see that they were drawn from a source. And I just want to let you know that if you want any full list or any one particular reference to content, please reach out to us. I didn't put it on this slide because it's asynchronous, and I don't want 2 or 3 slides of references, but everything's available. And I really want to thank you as we come to the close of this hour for you taking interest in our topic, because you can see that we've been interested in it over a long period of time in a variety of contexts. And I hope that you take some of the activities and kind of explore in your own way the way you want to adapt them, or just ideas that maybe now you have ideas of what you want to do in your classroom because you're kind of interested in students' L1 identity or their L2, or a comparison between the two. So hopefully we sparked a new avenue of interest for you, and also instructional practice that will inform your students' language learning and understanding of themselves.